In February 2025, Netflix confirmed that its 6-part, 9-hour-long documentary on Prince, directed by Ezra Edelman, would not be broadcast. Edelman is an Oscar-winning filmmaker best known for his documentary OJ, Made in America. He was the first filmmaker to be given full access to Prince's vault. This was no cut-and-paste documentary. Edelman had spoken to almost everyone living who had worked with Prince. In September 2024, there were signs that things were not going well with the documentary. The New York Times described it as a cursed masterpiece that the public may never be allowed to see. In the film, Edelman looked at the more difficult parts of Prince's life and career, including allegations of physical and mental abuse from his former partners. He also looked at the many contradictions in Prince's life. I mean, how does the Prince of Dirty Mind square with the Prince of his later years when he became a more conservative Jehovah's Witness? Are they two completely different people, or can you join the dots? When Prince's estate saw the final cut of the film, they were horrified. They feared that if it was broadcast, Prince would be at risk of being cancelled. It's unlikely that Edelman's Prince documentary will ever see the light of day. In this video, we'll explore what we know about the documentary, including the most scandalous details Edelman apparently uncovered, and we'll also look at what happened to Prince's estate after he died.
This is CNN breaking news.
And CNN has now confirmed that the artist Prince is dead. We're just getting confirmation. Earlier, we knew there was a police investigation underway at his estate studio in Minnesota. Now, official word. We're getting the word now that Prince has died. CNN's Miguel Marquez is following the story for us. So what do we know so far, Miguel?
When a much-loved music icon dies, their posthumous career begins immediately, and that was very much the case for Prince in 2016. After his death, he made history when 19 of his albums entered the Billboard 200. Prince hadn't enjoyed that kind of chart dominance since the mid-1980s. Prince had the potential to be one of the highest-earning deceased artists because he maintained a vault of unreleased material at Paisley Park containing thousands of songs that had never been heard before. Prince was a total control freak. The fact that he died without a will is so shocking. I mean, how could this man who just had to control everything leave his legacy in the hands of, what would you call it, fate? Lawyers? I do not know. Without clear guidance from the Purple One, it has greatly complicated the question of who should access the vault, what should be released from the vault, and in what time frame and in what format. As there was no will, Prince's estate was divided between Tyka Nelson, his only full sibling, and his various half-siblings. Tyka Nelson had her own musical career, kind of. She released a single in the late 80s called Mark Anthony, and it was about the fact that she had a crush on Mark Anthony. She wrote the song herself. I tracked it down on YouTube and had a listen, assuming it would be terrible, but it is actually quite good. So Tyka Nelson would have to take the lead on curating Prince's legacy, but she couldn't do it on her own. Prince's estate was very complex. It's one thing to inherit an estate comprised of money and property, but Prince's estate was comprised of songs, thousands and thousands of songs. And how exactly do you go about monetizing music in this day and age? It's the streaming era. People don't really buy records anymore. Well, they do, on special occasions, collectors, editions, etc. But most music is streamed. And how exactly would you go about packaging these quote-unquote new Prince albums? Do you just find 10 songs he recorded in 1997 that weren't released and put them together in an album that's just named after one of the songs. Like, how do you package it? How do you make sense of it? Prince's death also happened on the cusp of the great music gold rush as artists began to sell off their catalogues for vast sums of money. People like Bob Dylan and Stevie Nicks took massive checks to sell off all or part of their catalogues. Untangling Prince's estate was not going to be easy. He'd left no will, there were taxes that needed paying, and the estate was split between several siblings. In 2018, Primary Wave stepped in. They are a music publishing company, and they started buying bits of the estate from the various heirs. But crucially, the family still owned a majority of the estate at this point. The vault had begun to open up, gradually at least. In 2020, the Super Deluxe edition of Sign of the Times came out. Many Prince fans would cite this as his best album, and the reissue contained 63 songs that hadn't been officially released before. And this really gives you a sense of what a unique artist Prince was. I mean, how many artists could reissue one of their old albums and add 63 songs to the package? Very few. Prince's vault didn't just contain unreleased songs, it contained jam sessions, full concerts, videos. It was really a time capsule of his whole life and career. In 2019, Netflix stepped in because it's Netflix, so inevitably they wanted to be involved. They paid Prince's estate tens of millions of dollars for access to the vault. They were going to draw from all this unreleased material and produce a documentary. Making sense of Prince's life and career was not going to be easy. He was one of the most unknowable people in the rock and roll industry. He cultivated an air of mystery. He was willfully obscure in interviews. It was like he was constantly putting up smoke screens, trying to push people away just to make sure they could never get too close. Take this interview from 1995. Shortly after he changed his name to a symbol. He hadn't given an in-person interview for a long time, and he gave the interview under two conditions. One, that he wouldn't show his face, and two, that he wouldn't speak, which I think is actually really quite funny. And so in this interview, he whispers answers into his wife Maite's ear, and she has to translate his cryptic Delphic responses to the journalist.
Now the press keeps talking about the dispute with your record company. Is there a dispute there? I mean, it seems that's what's driven you out of America. That's what's made you change your name to an unpronounceable symbol.
He changed his name because his spirit told him to.
A spirit?
His spirit.
And do you feel freer now that you can't be addressed? A little bit?
So, as you can see from this interview, Prince loved to be obscure. When he did give interviews, he did not want to be pinned down on anything. He was always muddying the waters. His answers were incredibly vague. Neil Carlin wrote one of the best books about Prince. He's a Minneapolis-based journalist, and he had known Prince for many years. He may have interviewed Prince more than any other journalist. In his book, This Thing Called Life, he had this to say. One can be reasonably sure that if Prince calls you his best friend on Tuesday, by next Thursday he'd never speak to you again, ever. Once you were gone, you were gone. Elsewhere in the book, Carlin writes this. At his most knowable, Prince is a cubist painting where people can, if they have the time to kill, argue about the corners, contours, colours, or negative space of his being ad infinitum. If anyone was going to solve the Prince Rubik's Cube, it was going to be Ezra Edelman. He had the full resources of Netflix at his disposal, he had the backing of Prince's estate, and most of all, he had full access to the vault.
And the Oscar goes to O.J. Made in America. Ezra Edelman and Caroline Waterlow.
If you haven't seen Edelman's OJ documentary, all I can say is stream it now. It really is a masterpiece. Clocking in at just under 8 hours, it's more of a TV series than a feature film. And it tells you more than just the OJ Simpson story. It gives you the whole history of race relations in America. The depth of Edelman's storytelling is just extraordinary. And so Prince fans were hoping to see this kind of depth in his Prince documentary. Sasha Weiss from the New York Times is one of the few people to have seen Edelman's Prince documentary. On the New York Times Daily podcast, she was asked about the film, and this is what she had to say.
At a certain point, he had interviewed enough people, over 75 people, to start to get a clearer picture of Prince and to be able to marry a narrative of Prince's life from the beginning really to the end, where he died in a very mysterious way, with this footage that was in the vault. Mm-hmm. And it's not that there's a secret, but there's a complex, tortured, deeply traumatized person alongside the musical genius. And eventually, Ezra had what he felt was a solid cut of the film, and I was able to watch it.
And what did you think?
It's a masterpiece.
And it is a masterpiece that we will probably never get to see. So let's find out what Prince's estate didn't like about this film. One of the most controversial interviews in the film was with Prince's former girlfriend, Jill Jones. She had co-starred with Prince in Purple Rain and Graffiti Bridge. In the interview, Jones describes an altercation she had with Prince in 1984. She'd caught him making out with one of her friends, and in response she slapped him. He said something offensive to her and began to punch her in the face repeatedly. She considered pressing charges, but Prince's manager convinced her that it would ruin Prince's career if she did so, and so she didn't press charges. And she stayed around with Prince for many years after that. She says she was still very much in love with him. I'm already anticipating some Prince stans in the comments getting really angry, saying, why do we have to dredge up all this negativity? Can't we just let the music do the talking? Well, the answer to that is categorically no. Prince was one of the greatest artists of the last century, and the simple fact is, for an artist of that magnitude, when they die, people are going to look through all the available information and try to make sense of them. I mean, that's what you do with great artists, and it's how you can attempt to understand the culture that you live in. What's more, Prince is not the only artist of genius to have some skeletons in his closet. And here is director Ezra Edelman himself on the abuse allegations. He also discusses Jill Jones's response to Netflix's decision to cancel the project.
Can I read something to you?
I was wondering why your phone is out.
Jill Jones, who was a Prince protege, a muse, who spent essentially the 80s with him and was someone who was a girlfriend of Prince's, was in the film, and to me, one of the most truthful voices in the film, and was someone who discussed in detail an instance where she was abused by Prince physically. And by the way, that's not the totality of the story of her with Prince, but you still see how much she loves him, even though she went through an experience with him that was hard, a decade of her life wanting more, wanting to be an artist that got to do her own album, wanting to be his exclusive girlfriend or the girlfriend when she always was sort of not that. It was almost someone, again, when you talk about what it means to be a kept woman, or she even, she refers to him as a pimp in the movie. And by the way, this is one side, but this is what she wrote after the news came out about the film being canceled. Prince was a man who lived under the weight of expectation, both his own and those of the world that adored him. He built a persona so larger than life that it became a prison, a gilded cage, one he could never fully step out of. Prince's struggle with drug addiction was deeply intertwined with his relentless pursuit of perfection, an impossible standard he imposed on himself to satisfy a fan base that craved his mystique, his eccentricity, and his ever-evolving artistry. At his core, he was a consummate people pleaser, trapped in the expectation to remain an enigma, always surprising, always beyond reach. The tragedy lies in the fact that so many refused to acknowledge the truth of who he really was. He understood this better than anyone. He knew that revealing his true self, stripped of the carefully crafted persona, would lead to rejection. And in a way, he was right. The recent choices made by Netflix and his estate only reinforced this truth. The world is unwilling to accept Prince as a man, only as a myth. Without the elaborate stagecraft, without the veil of mystery, his raw humanity is deemed insufficient. His struggles, his journey, his sacrifices, all the elements that shaped him will remain obscured. Instead, the world will likely receive a sanitized, polished version of Prince, a carefully curated illusion that erases the depth of his reality.
Yeah, I should have interviewed her.
The documentary also explored Prince's incredibly complicated relationship with religion and sexuality. To give an example, here's Des Dickerson. He played guitar with Prince early in his career. You can see them on tour here in the early 1980s. Now, Des was a born-again Christian, and he ultimately left Prince's band because he was so shocked by Prince's X-rated songs. He just couldn't bring himself to play them anymore. In his later years, when Prince had stopped playing his X-rated songs, he was sometimes asked about them, and he would challenge interviewers by saying like, well, how X-rated were these songs really? When you compare it to the music of today, it's like nothing. But I would dispute that. If you take the song Sister from the Dirty Mind album, Prince describes losing his virginity to his sister when he's underage and she's in her 30s, and the song makes it perfectly clear that he considered this experience to be pleasurable. We have Prince to thank, of course, for the parental advisory explicit content sticker that became prevalent on CDs, so you can see what Des had in mind when he left the band for religious reasons. When Des left the band, he was replaced by Wendy of Wendy and Lisa fame. Wendy and Lisa were a gay couple in real life, so Prince certainly didn't have a problem with the gays back in those days. Wendy would play with Prince until 1986. She was a key member of the Revolution and she appeared in the Purple Rain movie. But many years later, when Prince considered reforming the Revolution band, he had become a Jehovah's Witness by this point, and he allegedly said to Wendy that she could rejoin him on the road if she renounced her homosexuality. Now, this revelation Wendy shares in the Netflix documentary. This coming from a man who dressed like a pass-around party bottom. If Prince had become homophobic in his later years, it must have been some kind of cosmic joke. I mean, how could this guy, take a look at him, this gender-bending queen who pranced around on stage in high heels, how could he possibly have been homophobic? It just doesn't make any sense. Well, unfortunately, Prince's homophobia, or at the very least his opposition to gay marriage, was widely reported when he was still alive, and nobody in his orbit really tried to deny it, because after he became a Jehovah's Witness, a very devout one, it's not surprising that he would adopt such views. I first saw Prince in concert in 2002 on the One Night Alone tour in Manchester, and he was great, but it was one of his more difficult shows. He was performing mostly songs from the Rainbow Children, and he had certainly stopped performing his X-rated songs by this point. And at times the show was quite preachy. I remember at one point he was going on about birthdays and how you only have one. This is a Jehovah's Witness belief, so you're not supposed to celebrate birthdays. But I was just stood there in the audience thinking, no Prince, nice try, but you're not going to convert me. This was Prince at his most preachy. The Rainbow Children era was quite full on. His wife, Maite Garcia, wrote about it in her autobiography. She had this to say: musically, it's Prince, and therefore extraordinary, but the storyline is a thinly veiled parable about Jehovah's Witnesses, and in that scenario, there's a beautiful unbeliever who gets banished to a foreign land. Meanwhile, the wise one hooks up with another woman conveniently sent to him by God. When I heard it, I fought the impulse to roll my eyes. The other woman was Manuela, and Prince would soon leave Maite and marry Manuela. She would be his second and final wife. And this was not the only controversy from the Rainbow Children album. Some people even accused Prince of writing anti-Semitic lyrics, particularly on the song Muse to the Pharaoh, in which he seems to downplay the Holocaust. But, well, what can I say? I'm from a Jewish background. I've read through those lyrics closely. I think they're clumsy and conspiratorial, but I don't think he leans into anti-Semitism. Ezra Edelman is from a Jewish background, and he explored the anti-Semitism question in the documentary. Now, when he presented the final cut of the film to Prince's estate, they were not happy, and they sent him a 17-page document with various changes they wanted to be made. Legally, Prince's estate had the right to challenge Netflix over factual inaccuracies in the film, but Edelman insists that the 17-page memo he received was comprised of editorial changes they wanted making, not factual changes. So it looks like the estate wanted the anti-Semitism and homophobia allegations removing in their entirety. Edelman pushed back, and Prince's estate tried a different tactic. They said, "Oh, hang on a minute, we said you could license music for 6 hours worth of footage. This film is now 9 hours long, so you can go ahead with it if you can trim it from 9 hours to 6 hours. Removing 3 hours worth of footage would essentially have ripped the heart out of the film. As Edelson was finalizing the Book of Prince to give the film its full name, ownership of Prince's estate was evolving as Prince's surviving siblings sold all or part of their shares in the estate, and Tyker Nelson, Prince's only full sibling, passed away. In this 2024 read from the New York Times, Sasha Weiss outlined how the film was probably dead in the water. Interestingly, she got some exclusives. Right here, this picture of Edelman's editing suite is perhaps the only image you'll ever see from his documentary. She also got a picture of his office walls where he had all his research laid out. In February 2025, Netflix confirmed that they were siding with Prince's estate. Ezra Edelman's Prince documentary would not be broadcast. The Book of Prince was over. It was a sad day for Prince fans, but it was also a sad day for people who value the truth more generally, because what Netflix and Prince's estate are saying is, we can't handle the unvarnished Prince. We can't handle the warts and all Prince. We can only have the sanitized version of Prince. At the time of making this video, Netflix has just released its Meghan Markle program with Love Meghan, in which she goes all tradwife and makes fruit platters and transfers pretzels from one bag to another and puts seeds in party bags and blows up balloons and does other fascinating things that can teach you how to be the perfect hostess. In 2023, Netflix had a massive hit with its David Beckham documentary, and while the Beckhams are a lot more fun than Meghan Markle, this is nonetheless a documentary approved by the subject, so it plays pretty safe. So you can see where Netflix are coming from with their documentary offerings. They are playing it safe, they are trying to maintain access to huge celebrities like the Beckhams and Meghan Markle. From a commercial standpoint, this makes sense, and Netflix are apparently partnering with Meghan Markle in line with her new series, documentary, whatever you want to call it. They're going to be selling her products if she ever gets round to releasing them. So perhaps Ezra Edelman's Book of Prince just doesn't have a place among the more sanitized documentaries Netflix is showing at the minute. Perhaps Edelman's film is just too challenging. The chances of the Book of Prince getting an official release are slim to non-existent, but I'll leave you with a consoling thought. Prince was one of the most bootlegged artists ever, so if someone leaks the documentary, it could become the most bootlegged documentary ever made. But for now, the Book of Prince remains buried in Netflix's vault. This is supremely ironic because thousands of songs remain buried in Prince's vault, and we as Prince fans can only hope that one day we will get to hear them.